The moment that changed everything. The golden hues of sunset stretched across the Sacramento skyline, casting long shadows over the bustling city streets. The air was thick with the hum of the evening rush, headlights flickering on as commuters made their way home. Eric Porter exhaled slowly, adjusting the air conditioning in his sedan. The day had been long, draining, and he was eager to leave it behind. The faint murmur of the radio played in the background, a soothing contrast to the chaos outside. As he approached an intersection, the light turned yellow. He eased off the accelerator, his foot hovering over the brake. The glow of the streetlights shimmered on his windshield as the signal flicked to red. And then, flashing red and blue lights erupted behind him, slicing through the dimming sky like a warning. The sharp wail of a siren followed. Eric's stomach tightened. His hands instinctively gripped the wheel as he flicked his gaze toward the rearview mirror. A police cruiser loomed behind him, its presence impossible to ignore. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, and guided the car toward the curb. The rhythmic thump of his heartbeat echoed in his ears. With practiced composure, he rolled down his window, waiting. The door of the cruiser swung open. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, a man built from rigid lines and discipline with a buzz cut sharp enough to match the crispness of his uniform. His badge gleamed under the streetlights, the weight of authority settled firmly on his chest. His walk was deliberate, calculated, confident, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who expected to be obeyed. Eric remained still, his face impassive, as Larson approached. "License and registration," the officer ordered, his voice carrying a clipped edge of control. Eric didn't hesitate. With steady movements, he reached into the glove compartment, retrieving his documents. He handed them over in silence, but he could feel it. The weight of Larson's gaze, studying him, measuring him, looking for something. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning in slightly. Eric met his eyes, his expression neutral. "Not entirely sure." His voice was polite, calm, but firm. Larson's lips pressed into a thin line. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, a flicker of hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned slightly. "I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't answer right away. Instead, he lingered, watching, weighing. The conversation was no longer about a traffic stop. It had shifted. The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. He glanced down at the license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" A beat of silence. Eric's jaw tightened, barely noticeable. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't looking at the address anymore. He wasn't listening to the words. His questions began to change, taking on a different edge, subtle but sharp. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Eric held his gaze. "Just going home." The answer was simple. Director. But the tension in the air refused to break. Larson didn't see a man just trying to get home anymore. He saw something else. Eric felt it. The weight of judgment pressing down, the silent accusations lurking beneath the surface. He could see it in the way Larson's posture shifted, in the way his hand hovered just a little too close to his holster, in the way his eyes narrowed as though searching for justification. And yet, Eric remained still, unshaken. He had been here before. His calm wasn't ignorance. It was control. Larson took a step back, rolling Eric's license between his fingers, his expression unreadable, until it wasn't. A slow shift, something smug settling in the corners of his mouth, as if he had already made his decision. "Step out of the car for me." The words landed heavy in the air. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened, if only for a second. And in that moment, he knew. This was no longer just a routine stop. This was something else, something bigger, and it was only the beginning. Eric's fingers tightened briefly around the steering wheel, a fleeting reaction he quickly controlled. His face remained unreadable, his expression smooth as glass. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" His voice was even, measured, not challenging, not fearful, just clear. For the briefest second, Larson's lips twitched. as if suppressing an instinctive response, but he masked it just as quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car." His tone carried an unmistakable weight. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The words were laced with quiet threat, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Eric exhaled slowly, letting the tension roll over him before reaching for the door handle. The air outside was thick with an unfamiliar heaviness as he stepped out onto the pavement. Larson's sharp gaze flickered over him, sweeping from his face down to his polished shoes, as if measuring every inch. Eric was taller than the officer, broader in the shoulders. His tailored suit was crisp, his posture composed. Nothing about him spoke of defiance, only quiet confidence. Every detail, from the meticulous knot of his tie to the sheen of his wristwatch, suggested a man who was careful, precise. And yet none of that seemed to matter. Larson jerked his chin toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Eric complied, his movements deliberate, smooth, controlled. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" His voice carried no edge, only the weight of a man who understood exactly what was happening. Larson's mouth curled into a faint smirk. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed with force. For the first time, Larson hesitated. A flicker of something flashed across his face, brief but telling. A momentary falter in his composure. His hand drifted toward his belt, a reflex more than a necessity, a silent warning rather than an action. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. Eric held his gaze. "I'm simply asking a question." There was no defiance in his words, just a steady, unshaken clarity. And somehow, that unsettled Larson more than anger ever could. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide?" Eric let the silence stretch between them, unbroken. Then finally he answered, "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Larson scoffed, but something in his stance shifted. He stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car, as if trying to regain his footing in an interaction that wasn't going the way he had anticipated. There was something about Eric that threw him off balance. No fear, no fumbling excuses, no nervous glances or desperate compliance. Instead, there was poise, control, a presence that refused to shrink under the weight of expectation. Larson's brow furrowed. "You seem pretty confident." The words were almost to himself, an observation laced with something he couldn't quite place. "Like you think you know how this is going to play out." Eric tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." For the first time, Larson's face shifted. Not irritation, not arrogance, something sharper, defensive. His mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. Eric's unwavering calm was like a mirror Larson didn't want to look into, reflecting something uncomfortable back at him. The silence stretched, thick with something neither of them could name, but both could feel. The air between them crackled, electric with unspoken tension. Larson tapped his fingers against the holster at his hip, the smallest motion, yet it carried so much weight. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being questioned, at least not like this. He wasn't used to someone like Eric. His gaze flickered to the sedan again, searching, reaching for a reason, one that he hadn't yet manufactured. His jaw tightened. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood." The shift in his tone was subtle but clear. Eric raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" He repeated the word, the incredulity in his voice undeniable, though still restrained. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Larson's mouth pressed into a thin line, and for a fraction of a second his composure cracked. "I'm not going to ask you again." Eric hesitated, not out of fear, but because in that moment a realization settled over him like a heavy weight. This wasn't about a stop sign. It never had been. And as he looked into Larson's eyes, he knew. This was a test that had been played out on countless streets, in countless cities, a test that he had seen before. But this time, he refused to fail. A reckoning in the shadows. Eric hesitated just for a moment. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. Something restrained. Something measured. Then, without protest, without a word, he turned. He placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. The metal was warm beneath his skin, still clinging to the last traces of the day's sun. But the heat outside was nothing compared to the heat pulsing in the space between him and Officer Larson. The crunch of Larson's boots against the pavement shattered the silence. Each step deliberate, each movement a reminder that, in this moment, he held the power. Or so he believed. His hands moved over Eric in sharp, practiced motions. But there was no care in them, only force. A little too rough, a little too slow. It wasn't just a search, it was something else. An assertion of control, a provocation, waiting for a response. But Eric didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He didn't so much as exhale harder beneath the weight of Larson's scrutiny. And that seemed to frustrate him even more. Larson stepped back abruptly, shaking his head. "You're clean." The words sounded like an admission he hated making, like he wanted them to mean something else. Eric turned slowly, his expression unreadable but his eyes razor-sharp. "Of course I am." His voice was smooth, steady, an immovable force. "Now, officer, if you're finished, I'm not done." Larson cut him off before he could finish, his voice rising a notch, spilling over with something unspoken. The words came too fast, too forcefully, betraying his need to keep the upper hand. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do," he pressed, eyes narrowing. "Care to explain why?" Eric didn't answer right away. He simply folded his arms across his chest, his stance relaxed despite the crackling tension between them. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said finally. His tone was light, almost conversational, but beneath it lay something far heavier. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's expression darkened. "That's so?" His gaze flickered with something sharp, something searching. "You a lawyer or something?" Eric's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Or something." The ambiguity in his response was intentional, and it landed exactly the way he wanted it to. Larson took a step closer, his body angling forward, invading Eric's space. His voice dropped lower, rougher, barely above a growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me?" His breath was hot, his words laced with simmering hostility. "Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric held his gaze, unblinking, unwavering. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness." A pause. Then with quiet precision, "And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words landed between them like a match tossed into dry grass. Larson's entire body tensed, his fingers curled at his sides, his jaw tightening. "Fairness?" He let out a sharp breath, a twisted half-laugh. "You think fairness is what this is about?" Something flickered behind his eyes. Something unguarded, something ugly. "People like you always—" The sentence cut off mid-air. The words dangled, incomplete, but the weight of them remained. Even unsaid, they hung there, thick and suffocating. Eric didn't move, didn't speak. But something about him shifted, a subtle but undeniable shift, a quiet power settling into place. "People like me," he repeated, his voice soft but laced with something sharp, something deliberate. Larson's expression flickered, just for a second, as if realizing he had stepped onto unsteady ground. "You know what I mean," he muttered. But the fire in his voice had dimmed. The certainty was no longer there. Eric nodded slightly. "I think I do." And in that moment, his composure was no longer just calm. It was something more dangerous. A blade wrapped in silk, a force Larson hadn't expected. "And I think we both know," Eric continued, his voice quiet but unwavering, that this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Larson opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came. For the first time, he hesitated. For the first time, the power in this interaction wasn't his. Eric let the silence stretch, let it settle between them like a judgment. Then finally, he spoke again, his voice steady, unshaken. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows knitted together, irritation flaring back up. A last attempt to cling to control. "I don't care who you are," he snapped. But the faint tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Eric reached slowly into his pocket, his movements deliberate. He saw it, the way Larson's fingers twitched near his holster. "I'm reaching for my badge," Eric said smoothly, his voice even. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." Larson's breath hitched. He watched Eric's hand emerge, holding a leather wallet. His eyes followed as Eric flipped it open, slow, methodical, until the gleam of a badge caught the light. Eric met his gaze. His tone was almost casual. "Eric Porter," he said, "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." The moment shattered. Larson stiffened. His gaze snapped to the badge, then back to Eric's face. Everything, the arrogance, the confidence, the thinly veiled hostility, evaporated in an instant. For the first time that night, Larson wasn't the one in control. And this was a moment he would never forget. Larson's breath hitched as he stared at the badge in Eric's hand, his mind scrambling for an explanation, for some way to twist this moment into something less damning. But the cold, undeniable truth gleamed in the dim light. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a reckoning. "Internal Affairs," Larson echoed, his voice cracking around the syllables like they burned on the way out. "Yes." Eric cut him off before he could stumble further, his voice carrying no malice, only an unshakable certainty. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the men and women who wear this badge uphold the integrity and values it was meant to represent." The color drained from Larson's face. His posture, once rigid with authority, loosened. Not in surrender, but in the dawning realization that the ground beneath him had shifted. He took a small step backward, and his hand, which had rested so confidently on his belt, fell away as if the weight of his own badge had suddenly become unbearable. Eric moved forward, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with the quiet, undeniable power of a man who knew exactly where this moment was headed. The space Larson had instinctively created, Eric filled without hesitation. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" His tone was level, controlled, but there was something sharp beneath it, something that cut deeper than raised voices ever could. Larson didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in quicksand, but had no idea how to stop sinking. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, though his voice hardened slightly. "Though that's bad enough. It's not even the baseless escalation, though that speaks volumes." He let the words settle, let the weight of them press down on the man in front of him. "It's the fact that you did all of this without even knowing who you were dealing with." Larson swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights," Eric said, each word deliberate, as if stacking bricks in a wall Larson could no longer climb over. "That I wouldn't understand the laws you swore to uphold." Larson parted his lips, some weak protest forming on his tongue, but the words never made it past his throat. Eric didn't blink, didn't break his gaze. "Because," he went on, voice unwavering, "I didn't fit your idea of someone who deserved respect." Silence. Not the kind that signaled the end of a conversation, the kind that exposed the truth, raw and undeniable. Eric's words weren't filled with anger, but they carried something far more damning, the weight of an undeniable truth. And Larson felt every ounce of it. "And that," Eric said, stepping back just enough to let Larson breathe, "isn't just a problem for me. That's a problem for every single person you encounter while wearing that uniform." Larson's shoulders sagged slightly. It wasn't submission. It was something closer to realization, the slow, painful comprehension of a truth he could no longer ignore. His gaze flickered to the badge in Eric's hand, as if hoping it would disappear if he looked away long enough. But it wouldn't. Eric's voice remained steady, but his presence filled the space between them, leaving Larson nowhere to run. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson's lips parted, his instincts warring with his intelligence, debating whether to push back or fall in line. The hesitation was his undoing, and then Eric lowered his voice just slightly, just enough to make sure the next words cut deep. "You're going to hear from me again," he said, his voice calm but absolute. "Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man who decides whether you deserve to keep that badge at all." Larson's face reddened. He swallowed hard, his throat working around the weight of words he could no longer justify. With trembling hands, he reached into his chest pocket, pulling out Eric's license and registration. He handed them over without a word. Eric took them, sliding them back into his wallet with slow, measured movements. Then, without urgency, he walked to his car. He placed one hand on the door handle but didn't get in just yet. Instead, he turned back, locking eyes with Larson one final time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said. His voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. It carried like a promise. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone, makes you accountable to everyone." And with that, he got into his car, started the engine, and drove away. Larson remained where he stood, his confidence shaken, his future suddenly uncertain. But for Eric, this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The drive home was silent, but inside Eric's head the encounter replayed itself over and over. Not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had encountered like this, and he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Eric had the power to act. By morning, he sat at his desk at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, the early sunlight casting thin slats of gold through the blinds. A file lay open in front of him. Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't pristine. It wasn't littered with scandal, but it carried warning signs, subtle ones. Complaints of unprofessional conduct, a pattern of excessive stops, vague justifications, and misunderstandings that had always been swept aside before they could be fully examined. Eric leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingertips together as he studied the pages in front of him. Larson wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a culture that had been allowed to fester, and Eric had no interest in slapping a bandage over a bullet wound. A soft knock on his door broke his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped inside, a stack of reports tucked under her arm. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said, her voice as crisp as ever. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her hands. "Thanks, Linda." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda paused. She knew Eric well enough to sense when something held weight. "Of course," she said, before slipping out of the room. Eric turned his attention back to Larson's file. This wasn't just about one man. This was about an entire system that had allowed men like Larson to operate unchecked. And if there was one thing Eric had learned, it was this: culture doesn't change from the bottom. It changes from the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a windowless conference room. The chief, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a presence that commanded the room, listened intently as Eric recounted the previous night's traffic stop. When Eric finished, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't just about one officer. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, nodding slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted, "but we've always handled it internally, quietly." Eric's expression didn't shift. "That ends today." Eric's gaze never wavered as he leaned forward, his voice measured but unshakable. "And that's the problem." Chief Daniels met his eyes, the weight of the conversation pressing between them. "Quiet doesn't fix anything," Eric continued, his tone carrying the kind of conviction that left no room for argument. "Quiet lets it keep happening. Quiet allows the same mistakes, the same injustices, to repeat themselves, unchecked. It's time to be loud." Daniels exhaled slowly, his fingers lacing together on the table in front of him. He was a man who had spent years navigating the political currents of leadership, but Eric could see it, the understanding, the uneasy acceptance of truth settling in his expression. "What exactly are you proposing?" Eric didn't hesitate. "A full department-wide review, not just of individual officers, but of our entire system, our training, our protocols, the way we hold ourselves accountable. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't set the standard, if we don't demand more from ourselves, how can we expect the people we serve to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, studying Eric intently. "You realize this is going to ruffle some feathers." Eric's response was immediate. "Good. It's about time someone did." The weeks that followed were relentless. Eric worked with a singular focus, pouring himself into the task. He pored over case files, dissected misconduct reports, and sat in meeting after meeting, pushing for transparency where there had only been shadows. He didn't just analyze data. He spoke directly to officers, to community members, to people who had been on both sides of the badge. He listened, he documented, and he refused to look away. The Larson incident had become more than just a single case. It was a spark that had ignited something larger, something long overdue. It forced the department to confront what it had so often tried to ignore. And as for Larson himself, his case was brought before an internal review board. Eric didn't hide his involvement. He sat across from the officer in the hearing room, watching as Larson shifted uncomfortably under the weight of questions he had never expected to answer. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. The result? A suspension. Some might have called it a victory, but Eric knew better. The goal was never just to punish Larson. The real battle was making sure there wouldn't be another Larson. Months later, Eric stood behind a podium addressing a packed community hall. The audience was a mix of uniformed officers, city officials, and local residents, some skeptical, some hopeful, all listening. Eric didn't speak of blame. He spoke of responsibility. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," he said, his voice carrying through the room, steady and certain. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve actually do so, with integrity, with fairness, and with a deep, unwavering respect for every single person they encounter." A hush settled over the crowd, the weight of his words pressing into the space between them. "That's the badge I believe in." His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. "And that's the badge we are building, together." The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. Because this wasn't the end of the fight, it was only the beginning. As he stepped down from the podium, his gaze swept across the room. Some faces were skeptical, unwilling to believe that real change was possible. Others were cautious, waiting to see if this was just another speech or something more. But there were those who looked at him with something else. Hope. It wouldn't happen overnight. Change never did. But it would happen. And for now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to real change. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what's possible when we refuse to stay silent.